Everyone in the restaurant froze. The shy waitress, who barely spoke above a whisper, had just done something that left even the richest woman in Charleston speechless. A single moment, a few movements of her hands, and suddenly the air turned heavy with tension and disbelief. But let's rewind. Because before that moment, no one knew the truth about Grace Miller and what she carried inside her heart. Tonight, you'll see how a simple act of kindness at a seaside restaurant unraveled decades of secrets, love, and betrayal, and how one woman's quiet strength silenced an entire room. But before we begin, tell me where you're watching this from, and what time it is where you are right now. If you love emotional, drama-filled stories about love, betrayal, and the unexpected twists that life throws our way, hit that subscribe button because this story, will stay with you long after it ends. Let's go back to the moment everything changed, when a shy waitress greeted a millionaire's mother and stunned the world without saying a single word. Grace Miller worked the morning shift at the Seaside Ember, a quiet coastal restaurant just off King Street in Charleston, South Carolina. She had been there for only 3 months, but in those 3 months, she had already learned that silence was her safest armor. Grace wasn't like the other waitresses. She didn't gossip, didn't flirt with customers for tips, and rarely made eye contact for too long. She kept her head down, her apron neatly tied, her hair tucked behind her ear, always listening, always observing. But that morning, something felt different. The restaurant buzzed with whispers of a private lunch reservation made under a name that carried weight. Mrs. Eleanor Whitford, mother of the elusive billionaire, Alexander Whitford, had requested a table by the window overlooking the bay. Eleanor was known across Charleston society, elegant, refined, and untouchable, but few knew the truth. She was deaf and rarely spoke in public. Grace only found out minutes before the woman arrived. She overheard the hostess muttering in panic, "She's deaf. We don't even know sign language. What do we do?" Everyone turned to each other, waiting for someone else to volunteer. No one moved. Grace took a quiet breath, smoothed her apron, and said softly, "I can do it." The hostess blinked in disbelief. "You? Grace, this isn't the time to practice. This is the Whitfords. We can't mess this up." Grace simply nodded, her eyes steady. "I know what I'm doing." And when Mrs. Whitford entered, poised in a pearl gray suit, diamonds glinting under the chandelier, the entire restaurant seemed to straighten up. She carried herself with a kind of grace that demanded silence without asking for it. Grace approached with careful steps, her heart pounding so hard she feared the woman might see it beating through her uniform. She set the menu gently on the table, smiled, and began to sign. "Welcome to the Seaside Ember. It's an honor to serve you today." The old woman froze. Her cloudy blue eyes widened, trembling slightly, as if she had just heard a ghost speak. Then slowly she smiled, a soft, trembling smile that carried years of loneliness and relief. No one else in the restaurant understood what had just happened, but Mrs. Whitford reached out, touched Grace's hand, and signed back, "You speak with your hands like my son once did." Grace's breath caught. She hadn't expected that. Behind her, the manager whispered to the hostess, "What is she doing? Is this part of the service?" But Grace didn't hear them. For the first time in a long time, she felt seen. Every gesture she made was careful, graceful, alive. And then the restaurant door opened again. A tall man in a black suit entered, his expression unreadable, his presence heavy. He walked straight toward Mrs. Whitford's table. The staff went silent again, tension rising. Grace stepped back instinctively, bowing slightly. The man placed a hand on the older woman's shoulder, protective, almost possessive. Mrs. Whitford smiled and signed something quickly to him. His gaze followed her fingers, then shifted to Grace. Those eyes, gray, piercing, cold, studied her like she was a puzzle he didn't remember putting together. "Who taught you that?" he asked, his voice low, controlled. Grace hesitated, unsure if she should answer. I learned sign language years ago. For my mom," she said softly. He didn't respond. Instead, he turned back to his mother, nodding slightly, and took a seat. But even as Grace walked away, she could feel his gaze following her, sharp, calculating, and curious. Later, when the lunch ended and the Whitfords left, the manager approached Grace, trying to sound casual. "Good work with the lady. You might have just saved our reputation today." Grace smiled faintly, her mind still replaying the moment when Mrs. Whitford signed those words. "Like my son once did." She didn't know what they meant. Not yet. But that night, as she locked up the restaurant and looked out at the restless sea, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had just begun, something bigger than her, and far more dangerous than she could ever imagine. 2 days passed. The restaurant returned to its usual rhythm, morning coffee orders, tourist chatter, and the smell of freshly baked bread drifting from the kitchen. But Grace couldn't shake the memory of that lunch, the way Mrs. Whitford had looked at her, like she had seen someone she once loved, the way the man in the black suit had stared, unreadable, but intense. It lingered in her mind like a song that refused to stop playing. By Thursday evening, Grace had convinced herself it meant nothing. She was just a waitress. They were billionaires. Their worlds didn't collide, not in real life. But that illusion shattered when the door swung open just before closing time. A man in a dark coat stepped in, holding an envelope. "Grace Miller?" he asked. Grace froze mid-cleaning. Yes?" He handed her the envelope. "No return address," he said simply, then walked out into the rain. She stared at it, hesitant. The envelope was thick, embossed with a silver emblem, a W wrapped around an ivy crest. The Whitfords. Her heart began to race. She took it to the staff locker room, sat down on the bench, and opened it carefully. Inside was a single cream-colored card. "Mrs. Eleanor Whitford cordially invites Miss Grace Miller to a private dinner at the Whitford estate Saturday evening 7 p.m. Grace blinked, stunned. A dinner invitation from one of the richest women in South Carolina. Why? She read it again, searching for a reason, a note, anything. But there was nothing. Just the time, the address, and a signature written in graceful, flowing ink. Her hands trembled as she folded the invitation back into its envelope. Part of her wanted to throw it away, to forget it ever arrived. But another part, the one she had buried for years, whispered softly, "Go." That night she lay awake staring at the ceiling of her small apartment above the old bookstore. She thought about her mother, the long nights spent learning sign language by candlelight, the soft hands guiding hers, the laughter that used to fill their tiny home before illness took her away. Grace had learned to stay small after that, invisible, quiet, careful. But something about that invitation stirred something she hadn't felt in a long time, curiosity. By Saturday evening, her nerves were a storm. She wore her best dress, navy blue, modest but elegant, and borrowed a pair of earrings from her neighbor. When the car arrived, a sleek black sedan with tinted windows, she almost didn't get in. But she did. The drive took them far beyond the city, through winding roads lined with oak trees and lantern-lit gates. Finally, the car stopped in front of a mansion that looked like something from another world. Marble pillars, cascading fountains, a grand staircase framed by glass chandeliers that shimmered like starlight. A butler opened the door, offering his hand. "Miss Miller, welcome to Whitford Estate." Grace stepped out, her breath catching at the sight of the mansion glowing softly against the night sky. It was beautiful and intimidating. She followed the butler through the grand foyer, walls lined with oil paintings, a sweeping piano melody echoing from somewhere distant. At the far end of the room stood Mrs. Whitford, radiant as ever, seated near a grand window. Grace approached and smiled warmly, signing, "Thank you for inviting me, Mrs. Whitford." The woman's eyes brightened. She signed back, "I had to see you again. You reminded me of someone I once lost." Grace's throat tightened, unsure what to say. Before she could respond, a familiar voice spoke from behind her. "She reminds you of everyone you ever liked, Mother. That's the problem." Grace turned sharply. There he was, the man in the black suit, standing at the doorway with that same piercing look. Only now he wasn't just a man. He was the heir to the Whitford fortune, Mr. Alexander Whitford. He walked closer, his gaze locked on hers. "You're the waitress," he said flatly. "From the Ember." Grace nodded, her palms sweating. "Yes, sir." He studied her quietly. Then, without a smile, he said, "Mother doesn't usually invite strangers to dinner, especially not employees." Mrs. Whitford tapped his hand to get his attention, signing sharply, "Be kind. You have no idea who this girl is." Alexander frowned, confused. "What are you talking about?" But the old woman only smiled mysteriously and turned back to Grace. "Come, dear," she signed. "Sit beside me. Tonight I want to tell you something my son has forgotten." Grace sat down, her heart pounding. Alexander took the seat across from them, arms crossed, still skeptical. The dinner began quietly. Elegant dishes, soft music, polite conversation, but beneath it all, an undercurrent of tension. Grace could feel Alexander's gaze, sharp and unreadable. She tried not to meet it. Midway through the meal, Mrs. Whitford placed her hand gently on Grace's. Her eyes were soft but heavy with emotion. Then she signed, "Your mother's name was Clara Miller, wasn't it?" Grace froze. Her fork clattered onto the plate. How do you know that name?" she whispered. For a moment the room went still. Even Alexander's expression faltered. Mrs. Whitford smiled sadly, tears glistening in her eyes. "Because once upon a time," she signed slowly, "your mother saved my life." For a long moment, no one spoke. The air felt heavy, not with awkwardness, but revelation. Grace could feel the weight of a story pressing against the silence, something old and buried trying to surface. Mrs. Whitford sat back slowly, her hands trembling as she signed again. "Years ago, before all this," she gestured faintly to the mansion around her, "I wasn't who I am now. I was a teacher at the Charleston School for the Deaf." Grace blinked. "My mother, she was a volunteer there." The older woman nodded, eyes glistening. "Yes, Clara. I remember her smile. She came every Saturday with that little notebook, writing each sign again and again so she wouldn't forget. She had such patience. I was sick back then. She stayed late after every class, helping me communicate when my voice began to fail." Grace's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't heard that name, that version of her mother, in years. Her mother had never spoken about that time, never mentioned teaching the deaf, never mentioned Mrs. Whitford. Across the table, Alexander leaned forward slightly, his expression changing for the first time. "You knew her mother?" he asked quietly. Mrs. Whitford nodded. "Clara Miller was the kind of woman you don't forget. She had a heart made of light." She looked at Grace again, her smile softening. "And you have her hands." The room seemed to shrink around them. The chandeliers dimmed, the clinking of silverware faded away. Grace felt tears building but blinked them back, swallowing hard. "Why didn't you ever try to find her?" she whispered. Mrs. Whitford hesitated. Then she signed, "I did. But by the time I found the address she'd given me, it was too late. The neighbors said she'd passed, and there was a little girl left behind." Grace's heart dropped. The old woman's eyes softened as she continued, "I searched for you, Grace, I really did." Across the table, Alexander's eyes darted between them. Confusion, disbelief, maybe something else. "You're saying this waitress is—" "Enough," his mother signed sharply, cutting him off. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for her tea. "I don't need you to understand, Alexander. I just need you to listen." Grace sat still, her pulse loud in her ears. She couldn't understand why this woman cared so deeply. or why her son looked at her like she'd just cracked open a forgotten past. Mrs. Whitford smiled faintly. "I never forgot the promise I made to your mother," she said softly. "She once told me, if anything happens to me, just make sure my daughter grows up kind." Grace's throat tightened. That voice, her mother's words, felt like they were echoing through time. But then, the tone shifted. Mrs. Whitford's smile faded. Her hands paused mid-sign, trembling again before she set them down slowly. "Grace," she whispered, "I believe someone didn't want me to find you." Grace's breath hitched. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Whitford looked toward her son. "Alexander," she said firmly, "tell her what your father did." He stiffened. "Mother, not tonight." "Tell her." His jaw clenched. He stood from the table, running a hand through his hair before finally muttering, "My father wasn't the man people think he was." Grace's stomach twisted. The room seemed colder now. Alexander's voice dropped, almost a whisper. "He had dealings with people who didn't want his name tied to certain places. The school, the one your mother volunteered at, was one of them." Grace's pulse quickened. "What are you saying?" Alexander looked at her, eyes dark. "I'm saying your mother might have found something she wasn't supposed to, and my father, he made sure no one ever asked questions." The room fell silent again, except for the thunder outside. Grace's fingers trembled as she gripped the edge of the table. The world felt like it had tilted under her feet. Her mother, the woman who taught her kindness, who never raised her voice, caught up in something dark and secret tied to this family? Mrs. Whitford reached for her hand again, her eyes pleading. "I invited you here, Grace, because I need to know the truth before it's too late." Alexander turned away, staring out the rain-streaked window. His reflection looked fractured in the glass, torn between guilt and something unspoken. Grace swallowed hard, her voice barely a whisper. "What truth?" Mrs. Whitford looked at her, her voice trembling now. "The truth about what really happened to your mother, and who made it look like an accident." After dinner, Grace couldn't sleep. The words from earlier kept echoing through her mind. The truth about what really happened to your mother. She wandered through the dimly lit hallway, her shoes silent against the marble. Paintings of stern-faced ancestors lined the walls, generations of Whitfords watching her with eyes that seemed too alive. The mansion was beautiful, yes, but in the quiet, it felt haunted, not by ghosts, but by secrets. Her steps led her to a large oak door slightly ajar. Music drifted faintly from within, a soft piano melody, hesitant, almost broken. Grace pushed the door open and froze. Alexander sat at the grand piano, his fingers moving slowly across the keys. He didn't notice her at first. His shoulders tense, his jaw tight, playing a song that sounded like grief wrapped in melody. For a moment she just watched him. The cold CEO everyone whispered about suddenly looked human, vulnerable. Then he stopped playing. Without turning, he said quietly, "You walk quietly, Grace." Her heart skipped. "I didn't mean to intrude." He looked over his shoulder, offering the faintest smile. "You're fine. No one sleeps well here the first night." Grace stepped inside, her gaze catching on the piano. There was something sitting above the keys, an old framed photograph. Two women standing in front of a classroom chalkboard. One was unmistakably Mrs. Whitford, much younger. The other, Grace's breath caught, was her mother. She moved closer, her trembling fingers tracing the edge of the photo. "That's her," she whispered. "That's my mom." Alexander exhaled slowly. "I know." Grace turned sharply. "What do you mean, you know?" He hesitated. Then he reached for a drawer beneath the piano and pulled out a faded envelope. "I found this last year while going through my father's study. It was addressed to my mother, but it was never sent." He handed it to her. The paper was yellowed with age, the ink slightly smeared. Clara Miller scrawled across the front in familiar handwriting. Grace's pulse pounded in her ears. Inside were several photographs, the same classroom, the same faces, but one stood out. It showed her mother holding a folder marked Whitford Holdings, Confidential. Grace frowned. Why would she have this? Alexander shook his head slowly. My father ran an education grant program back then. It was supposed to fund schools like the one your mother worked at. But the money never reached them. The schools were shut down. Quietly. My father's partners covered it up. Grace's voice trembled. So my mom found out? He nodded. And that's when the accident happened. Her chest tightened. Her hands gripped the edge of the piano. It felt like her mother's voice was whispering through the room, faint, pleading. She looked up at Alexander, tears forming. Why didn't you tell me sooner? He sighed, looking down at the keys. Because I wasn't sure who to trust, and because I didn't know that you were her daughter until tonight. The air thickened with emotion, silence broken only by the ticking of the old clock by the door. Then Grace noticed something odd. Behind the framed photo on the piano, a second photo, partially hidden. She slid it out carefully. Her eyes widened. It wasn't a photo of her mother. It was a photo of Mrs. Whitford, standing beside a woman who looked exactly like Grace. Same eyes, same hair, same birthmark near the collarbone. Only, this photo was dated before Grace was born. She turned to Alexander, voice shaking. Who is this? He stared at the photo, his expression unreadable. That's impossible. Grace stepped back, her pulse quickening. Alexander, who is she? He ran a hand through his hair, his voice barely a whisper. She's not your mother, Grace. At least, not the one you think. Grace froze. Her mind reeled, everything spinning, the world tilting on its axis. The thunder outside roared, as if the sky itself was reacting to the truth. Alexander's gaze softened, filled with something between pity and dread. She was my father's nurse. Her name was Elena Brooks, and according to the file I found in his study, she disappeared the same week your mother died. Grace's hands went numb. The photo slipped from her fingers, shattering the frame against the marble floor. The reflection of broken glass glittered at her feet, catching fragments of two faces, her mother's and the stranger's, almost merging into one. She whispered, trembling, "What are you saying, Alexander?" He looked at her with quiet devastation. "I'm saying you might not be who you think you are." Grace didn't sleep. The image of that woman, Elena Brooks, haunted every blink, every breath. The same face, the same eyes, the same mark on her skin. It didn't feel possible, and yet the photograph didn't lie. By dawn, she found herself standing in the Whitford Library, surrounded by walls of books that smelled of dust and secrets. Mrs. Whitford's soft footsteps echoed behind her. "You couldn't rest either," the older woman said quietly. Grace turned, clutching the photograph. Who was she? Mrs. Whitford's expression shifted. Sadness, hesitation, and something like guilt. Elena Brooks was one of the nurses who took care of my husband during his illness. She was quiet, kind. Too kind, perhaps. My husband had a way of finding gentle souls and breaking them. Grace frowned. What happened to her? She disappeared, Mrs. Whitford said simply. No one ever found her. The police said she resigned and left the state, but I never believed that. Grace's voice wavered. She looks like me. Mrs. Whitford didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached for an old chest by the window, one Grace hadn't noticed before. She unlocked it with trembling hands and pulled out a small, leather-bound journal. This was found among Elena's things after she vanished, she whispered. I kept it all these years, hoping one day it would make sense. Grace opened it carefully. The pages were yellowed, written in neat cursive. The first entries were mundane, patient notes, medication schedules, mentions of long nights and sleepless shifts. But halfway through, the handwriting changed, shaky, uneven. He's not who everyone thinks he is. They think I don't notice the cameras, but I do. There's a girl, a child. They keep talking about her. I heard them say she'll be replaced before she's old enough to ask questions. Grace's breath caught. She looked up at Mrs. Whitford, her hands trembling. What does this mean? The older woman shook her head. I don't know, but my husband had a way of making problems disappear. If Elena knew something, he wouldn't have let her talk. Grace's voice dropped to a whisper. And the girl she mentioned? Mrs. Whitford looked at her with soft, sorrowful eyes. I think that girl was you. Grace's heart pounded so hard it hurt. The journal slipped from her hands, landing open on the floor. The ink from one last line smeared, as if written in a hurry. If you find this, I hope you know the truth about your mother. And me. They took everything from us. The words blurred through Grace's tears. Alexander entered the room then, his shirt slightly unbuttoned, eyes heavy from a sleepless night. What's going on? He asked quietly. Grace turned the journal toward him. Elena Brooks wrote about your father, about a girl, me. He exhaled sharply. I told you, my father's secrets go deeper than we thought. Mrs. Whitford turned to her son. There's more, isn't there? Alexander hesitated, then nodded. I wasn't completely honest last night. Grace's chest tightened. What else are you hiding? He looked at her, his voice low. The night your mother died, I was there. The room froze. Even the rain outside seemed to stop. Grace stared at him, her pulse hammering. You were what? Alexander swallowed hard. I was a kid, 12. I shouldn't have been awake, but I heard shouting in my father's office, a woman's voice. She was crying, saying she had proof. He told her to walk away. Then there was a crash. I ran, and by the time I got there, she was gone. He said she left. I believed him. Until I saw her face years later, Grace's voice trembled. My mother. He nodded slowly. She was the woman in his office. The world tilted under Grace's feet. Her mother, arguing with a millionaire who had everything to lose. A missing nurse who looked exactly like her. A journal that spoke of replacements. Nothing made sense, and yet everything was starting to connect in a way that chilled her to the bone. Mrs. Whitford whispered, Then the accident. Alexander nodded grimly. It wasn't an accident. It was cleanup. Grace staggered back, her hands covering her mouth. Her voice broke. You knew something all these years and said nothing. Alexander stepped forward, desperate. I didn't know who you were, Grace. I swear, I thought my father's sins were buried with him. But when you walked in last night, when my mother signed your name, I realized I'd seen you before. Grace's voice cracked. Where? In a photograph, he said quietly. The day of the funeral. He took a shaky breath. There was a little girl standing beside your mother's casket. My father told me never to ask who she was. Now I know. Grace's vision blurred. Her entire life, every quiet shift, every unspoken question, suddenly felt like part of someone else's cover-up. She whispered almost to herself, Then who was my mother, and what did she die for? Mrs. Whitford placed a trembling hand on her shoulder. That's what we're going to find out. Grace looked between them, mother and son, two people tied to the man who may have destroyed her past. For the first time, she didn't see wealth or power in this mansion. She saw a cage built from lies. Grace didn't remember walking back to her room. Her body moved on instinct, her mind a whirl of faces, echoes, and truths too sharp to hold. The journal still pressed against her chest, as if afraid someone might take it away. Every step down the long corridor whispered of the past. Paintings of men in suits and women in pearls watched her, their painted eyes full of pride, legacy, and unspoken guilt. One portrait caught her attention. It was larger than the rest, framed in ornate gold, dominating the hallway. A woman in a crimson gown. Her expression was calm, but her eyes, There was sorrow there. Grace stepped closer. She didn't know why, but something about the woman felt familiar. The plaque beneath read, Catherine Whitford, 1978. But it wasn't Catherine's face that drew her. It was what hid behind the canvas. A small tear near the edge of the frame, old but visible. Something had been pulled out once, or pushed in. Grace leaned closer, her heartbeat quickening. She slipped her fingers under the frame's edge and felt a soft resistance. Paper. She hesitated, then pulled. A folded envelope slid free, yellowed and fragile. On it, in trembling handwriting, for my daughter, when she finds the truth. Grace froze. Her throat tightened. The world around her blurred until all she could see was that name, daughter. She unfolded the paper carefully, her hands shaking as though touching a ghost. Inside was a letter written in the same handwriting as the journal. Elena's. My Grace, if you are reading this, then my silence has ended, one way or another. I had to hide you. They wanted to take you, to erase every trace of what they did. I couldn't let them have you. You are my light, the only good thing that ever came from my years in that house. Grace's tears blurred the ink, but she kept reading. He told me he loved me once. I believed him, the man with the silver ring and soft words. But love turned to ownership when I found out the truth, that the Whitfords built their fortune by silencing people like us. He called it a business decision. When I threatened to tell the world, he said he'd take care of it. That's when I knew I had to disappear. If you're reading this, it means you survived. It means my plan worked. But Grace, promise me, don't go looking for revenge. Go looking for the truth. Because buried under all that gold and marble, there's a woman who still has your father's heart locked away. And it isn't me. Grace stopped reading. Her lips trembled as she whispered, My father? The letter continued, Your real father wasn't the man who hurt me. He was the one who tried to protect us both. He worked for them, but when he learned the truth, he refused to stay silent. They destroyed him too. His name was Daniel Cole. He was kind, brave, and if you look closely, you'll find that he never stopped leaving clues for you. The last line was smudged, the ink warped by old tears. The truth is buried where the river bends. Where the music stopped. Grace lowered the paper slowly. Her breath came shallow and uneven. She didn't understand it all, not yet. But something inside her had shifted. This wasn't just about a job or a dinner gone wrong. This was about who she was. Her mother hadn't been a runaway nurse. She had been hunted, and her father, whoever he truly was, had tried to save them both. As Grace stood there, clutching the letter, Mrs. Whitford appeared at the far end of the hall. Her expression softened when she saw the envelope. I see you found it, she said quietly. Grace's voice broke. You knew? I knew my husband had secrets, Mrs. Whitford said, but not this, not you. The older woman stepped closer, her hands trembling. I think I know where that message leads. Grace turned, desperate. Where? Mrs. Whitford looked out the window toward the endless stretch of land beyond the mansion. Down by the river, there's an old gazebo. It used to be where the family hosted summer music recitals. It's been abandoned for years. Grace clutched the letter tighter. The river bend, she whispered. Mrs. Whitford nodded slowly. That's where the music stopped. Grace didn't know what waited by that river, but she knew one thing for certain. Her mother left more than memories behind. She left a truth powerful enough to destroy an empire. The path to the river was long and winding, overgrown with ivy and wildflowers reclaiming what wealth had forgotten. Mrs. Whitford's words echoed in her head. Where the music stopped. She followed the faint sound of running water until the trees opened up to reveal the gazebo, once grand, now broken by time. Its white columns were cracked, its roof sagging under years of silence. But something about the air here felt heavy, like the ground itself remembered. Grace stepped onto the wooden platform. The boards creaked under her weight. For a long moment she just listened, to the chirping of birds, the river whispering against the rocks, and the faint hum of something beneath. She dropped to her knees and brushed away a layer of leaves and dust. There, a small iron latch, nearly invisible, built into the floorboards. Her pulse quickened. She hesitated, then pulled. The latch lifted with a metallic groan, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. Grace swallowed hard. The air that rose from below was cold and stale, untouched for decades. She switched on her phone's flashlight and began to climb down. Each step creaked like a warning. At the bottom she found a small brick chamber, walls damp with moss, shelves lined with old boxes and papers. She brushed one box open and froze. Inside were medical files, hundreds of them, each labeled with names, dates, and one repeated signature, Dr. Henry Whitford. Grace's breath caught. These weren't random records. They were patient files from a private clinic that no one had ever mentioned, and stamped across each document in faded ink were 3 chilling words. Subject terminated, closed. Her hands trembled as she opened one file after another. Men, women, all from poor neighborhoods, all listed as participants in treatment trials. Grace whispered, "Oh my God." The truth hit like lightning. The Whitford fortune wasn't built on investments or innovation. It was built on people, on experiments done under the guise of medicine. Mrs. Whitford's voice echoed from above, faint but worried. "Grace? Are you down there?" Grace looked up, panic rising. "Stay where you are. It's not safe." But it was too late. The older woman descended slowly, her eyes wide as she took in the room. She pressed a hand over her mouth. "I begged him to tell me what went on in that wing," she whispered. "He said it was charity work, that he was saving lives." Grace shook her head, her voice breaking. "He wasn't saving them. He was using them." Mrs. Whitford reached for one of the files. Her hands trembled as she read the name on it. "Elena Brooks," she whispered. Grace's chest tightened. Her mother's file. Inside were pages of notes, drug dosages, behavioral observations, and at the bottom, a final entry. Subject terminated following breach of confidentiality. No recovery required. Grace's world spun. The file fell from her hand and hit the floor, echoing through the chamber. She couldn't breathe, couldn't speak. Every lie, every silence, every polite smile from that family dinner. It all burned now. Mrs. Whitford sank to her knees beside her. "I didn't know, Grace. I swear to you, I didn't know." Grace's eyes filled with tears. "But your husband did, and he made sure no one else ever would." They sat in silence. The only sound was the river above them, flowing endlessly, as if trying to wash away the sins buried beneath. Grace wiped her face, determination hardening behind her tears. She looked around the room again and noticed something at the far wall, a metal safe embedded in the brick. Its handle rusted but still solid, and carved faintly above it were the initials, D.C., Daniel Cole, her father. Grace's heart pounded. She tried the handle, locked, but taped beside it was a single folded piece of paper. She tore it free, her fingers trembling. Inside, one line written in careful handwriting. "If you've come this far, you know what he did. The key is not metal. It's truth." Grace looked up, confused, until she noticed the letters etched along the safe's combination dial. Each one was part of a word, 5 letters. She thought back to her mother's letter, to the phrase that haunted every page, where the music stopped. Her fingers hesitated over the dial. Then she began to turn. M-U-S-I-C. The safe clicked. The door opened with a heavy creak. Inside, wrapped in a linen cloth, was a small wooden box. She lifted it out carefully and opened it. Inside lay a silver pendant shaped like a heart, and beneath it a stack of photographs. Her mother, holding a baby. her. And beside them, a man with kind eyes and a crooked smile, her real father, Daniel Cole. At the bottom of the box, a sealed envelope marked with the Whitford family crest. Grace opened it, and the words inside made her knees buckle. In the event of my death, transfer all assets to Daniel Cole, rightful heir and majority shareholder of Whitford Enterprises, Grace whispered, her voice trembling. My father was the heir. Mrs. Whitford gasped. That means... Grace looked at her, eyes blazing through tears. It means everything they stole belongs to me. The dinner was meant to be formal, controlled, a polite exchange between the wealthy Westons and the mysterious girl who'd somehow won their matriarch's heart. Grace stood at the head of the table, feeling out of place among the linen, the polished cutlery, the way the chandelier reflected in the wine glasses like tiny suns. Her thrift store dress didn't belong here, neither did she. But Eleanor Weston, strong, elegant, and silent, reached out her hand in that quiet, steady way that disarmed everyone. She gestured for Grace to sit beside her, and for a moment, it wasn't about money, or class, or reputation. It was about connection. The family conversation swirled around her, the polite, shallow words of people used to power. Grace caught bits and pieces. Charity gala, investor returns, new contract with Lark Brooks. She said little, smiling when appropriate, trying not to look overwhelmed. Then, without warning, Eleanor began signing again. Her hands moved gently. A question. Grace responded, and the room went silent. The others, the sons, the wives, the polished business associates, stared in confusion, because Eleanor was laughing, a soft, joyous, silent laugh that filled the room with warmth, though no sound left her lips. Grace signed back, her fingers trembling slightly, but confident enough to carry the meaning. It wasn't rehearsed. It was real. The two women spoke in silence while everyone else watched, two worlds communicating in a language the others couldn't hear. When Eleanor finally rested her hands, her eyes turned glassy with emotion. She reached out and touched Grace's cheek, and that was when Richard, her son, entered the room. He stopped mid-step. The man everyone whispered about. The one who controlled half the city's developments and was rumored to have no heart at all. His jaw tightened at the sight. The poor waitress sitting at his mother's right hand. The laughter on Eleanor's face. He didn't need to say a word. The tension told its own story. Grace immediately stood, her cheeks flushed. I'm sorry, I shouldn't... Eleanor reached for her arm, signing something quickly. Grace hesitated, nodded once, and quietly sat back down. The room waited, thick with awkwardness, as Richard poured himself a drink. He didn't look at her, not once. But that night, something shifted. Later, when Grace helped Eleanor back to her room, she caught sight of Richard standing in the hallway. His expression unreadable. He said only one thing. You shouldn't get too comfortable here, and walked away. Grace didn't sleep that night, because deep down she knew. He wasn't warning her. He was protecting something buried under years of silence and privilege, something she was getting dangerously close to uncovering. The storm came without warning that night. Grace stayed late, helping Eleanor settle into bed, her kind smile soft beneath the dim lamplight. The old woman signed goodnight, a motion that had become something more like a blessing, and drifted into sleep. Grace lingered in the quiet room for a moment, tidying the books on the nightstand. That was when she noticed it. A small envelope wedged between two thick photo albums. The paper was yellowed, its edges worn soft from time. Her name wasn't on it, but Eleanor's initials were embossed in faded gold at the top. E.W. For a second, Grace hesitated. She knew she shouldn't open it. But something about the weight of it, the way it seemed intentionally hidden, pulled at her curiosity. She slid it free. Inside was a letter and a photograph. The photo showed a younger Eleanor holding a baby, a boy with familiar eyes. The same eyes Grace had seen every day since she arrived here. Richard's eyes. Her heart began to race. Then she read the letter. The words were faded but still legible, written in elegant cursive. If you ever find this, it means the truth can no longer stay buried. The boy you raised was not meant for this life. His father was never told what really happened that night. And the girl who survived, carries the same mark. Grace's hand trembled. The girl who survived. She scanned the rest of the letter, her breath catching with every line. It spoke of a fire, an accident at a foster home years ago. 2 children were lost. 1 survived. A baby taken in by the Westons. And someone, a caretaker, who vanished afterward. Grace froze. Her mind flashed to faint memories she could never quite place. Flames, crying, a woman's voice whispering her name. Her name. She clutched the letter, her pulse thundering in her ears. Footsteps echoed in the hall. Grace quickly tucked the letter back where she found it, heart pounding. Richard stepped into the doorway, his expression hard. "What are you doing in here?" She swallowed. "Just cleaning up after your mother." He stared at her, long enough to make her look away. Then quietly he said, "You shouldn't go through things that aren't yours," and walked off, his tone sharp, his footsteps deliberate. But Grace wasn't just curious anymore. Now, she was terrified. Because the words in that letter had carved something deep into her chest. And though she didn't yet understand it, she had just touched the first thread of a secret that would unravel everything. Eleanor's silence, Richard's coldness, and her own forgotten past. Grace stood at the window, watching the storm rip across the ocean. Her reflection looked back at her, the same eyes, the same features, but for the first time she didn't recognize the woman staring back. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was a part of something she didn't yet understand. And by morning, she'd wish she'd never found that letter. She couldn't ignore it. Not anymore. The hidden envelope, the photograph, the words about the girl who survived, they all demanded answers. The study door loomed ahead, dark mahogany, locked with a key she had found in the kitchen drawer earlier. Her hand trembled as she slid it into the lock. Click. Inside, the room smelled of leather and old books. Stacks of papers, ledgers, and unopened envelopes covered the desk. It looked like the heart of the Whitford Empire, and maybe the key to everything. Grace began sifting through the papers, bills, contracts, letters, and then, tucked behind a ledger, a small leather-bound journal. The handwriting was unmistakable. Alexander Whitford. She opened it. Pages chronicled decades of secrets, failed experiments, hidden investments, family disputes, and then a section marked in red ink. She must never know. The girl from the fire. If she learns the truth, everything falls apart. Richard will have to be protected at all costs. Eleanor cannot remember, and the fortune must remain in our hands. Grace froze. Her pulse raced, her stomach twisted. Richard, protected at all costs? The sound of footsteps behind her made her whirl around. Richard stood in the doorway, arms crossed, his face unreadable. "You're curious," he said, flat. "You're always curious, aren't you?" Grace swallowed hard, clutching the journal. I just wanted to understand." "Understand?" His voice rose slightly, cold and dangerous. "You have no idea what you've stumbled into." Grace's eyes met his. "Maybe I do. Maybe I've been living in someone else's story long enough, and now I want the truth." Richard's face hardened, then softened, a flicker of something she couldn't place. Recognition, fear, maybe guilt. "You weren't supposed to be here," he said quietly. "But now that you are, you need to know. The fire, the girl who survived, that was you. You're the one they tried to erase." Grace felt her knees weaken. "My... what?" Richard stepped closer, lowering his voice. You weren't adopted by mistake. You were taken, hidden, protected from a family who wanted power more than love. And now, you're back, right where you're supposed to be. The journal slipped from Grace's hands, falling open to a page detailing names, dates, and her own birth date. Everything clicked. Every faint memory of the fire, the whispers, the missing years. Tears burned her eyes. You knew all along? Richard shook his head. No one told me until recently. But now, you need to see the rest. He reached for a drawer, pulling out an envelope sealed with wax. Inside were papers, adoption records, legal documents, and photographs, evidence of a life stolen and replaced. Grace stared at the proof, her heart hammering. Her parents, the fire, the Whitford's fortune, her identity, all connected in ways she could barely comprehend. Richard said nothing. He only watched her, the tension between them a storm as fierce as the one outside. Grace finally whispered, "Why? Why tell me now?" Richard's gaze hardened. "Because someone else is watching, someone who will stop at nothing to keep the past buried, and Grace, you've just become the most dangerous person in this house." Grace's hands shook as she realized the truth. She wasn't just uncovering a secret. She was now at the center of a battle that could destroy everything. And the first enemy wasn't outside. It was inside. She didn't hear him enter. A shadow moved in the corner of the room, soft footsteps against the hardwood. "You shouldn't be here alone," said a calm, steady voice. Grace looked up to see a man she didn't recognize. Tall, lean, in his late 30s with dark hair streaked with silver at the temples. He wore a tailored suit, expensive, understated, but the kind that didn't need to announce itself. Who are you?" Grace asked, clutching the envelope tighter. He held up his hands in a gesture of peace. "Name's Marcus Hale. I work here." Quietly, he paused, letting the words settle. "More importantly, I know the truth about your past. About the Whitfords." Grace's pulse quickened. You do?" "Yes," he said simply. "And if you want to survive this, you'll need someone who isn't afraid of the walls this family built around themselves. Someone who's seen what they do when they feel threatened." She studied him carefully. His expression was serious, honest even, but she had learned by now that appearances in this house were deceiving. "Why help me?" she asked. "Why not just leave me out of it?" Marcus's eyes darkened. "Because they're not just rich or ruthless, they're dangerous. And because, Grace, I think they underestimated you. Big mistake." Grace's stomach churned. "Underestimated me? I'm just a waitress. I don't have anything to fight with." He smiled faintly, but it wasn't warm. "You have something they don't. A claim to this family. A right to everything they've been hiding. And you're smart, Grace. Cleverer than anyone realizes." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small black USB drive. "Take this. It has files, evidence, proof of everything from the fire to the experiments to the legal documents that were manipulated. You'll need it, and trust me, it'll keep you alive longer than staying ignorant ever would." Grace hesitated. The temptation to run was strong. To throw the files in the trash, forget the mansion, forget the secrets. But she couldn't. Not now. She took the USB drive, fingers brushing against Marcus's. The touch was brief, professional, but there was weight in it, a promise, a warning. "Be careful," he said. "They watch everything. One false move, and they'll crush you." Grace nodded. I understand." Marcus gave her a final look before disappearing back into the shadows. She was alone again. But this time she wasn't powerless. She had a secret ally. And more importantly, she had the proof to challenge a family that had lied for decades. Her hands shook as she looked down at the USB drive. Everything she thought she knew about her life was about to change, and the Whitfords wouldn't know what hit them. Grace had spent hours going through the USB drive Marcus had given her. Files, photographs, scanned letters, hidden recordings, everything that proved the truth of her past and the Whitfords' deceptions. She didn't need to understand every detail yet. She only needed one thing: leverage. Her first target was Vanessa Whitford, Richard's younger sister. Vanessa had always seemed the least threatening, elegant, social, obsessed with appearances, but Grace had noticed how she controlled what the public saw and often whispered poison into the right ears. Tonight, Vanessa had a private gathering in the library with a few high-profile socialites. Grace waited outside, pretending to adjust a silver tray of hors d'oeuvres. Her heart thudded. Every moment counted. When Vanessa stepped out to check the view from the balcony, Grace saw her opportunity. "Vanessa," Grace said softly, voice steady despite the adrenaline. The socialite turned, startled to see the waitress alone and confident. "Yes?" Vanessa's tone was polite but sharp, a blade hidden behind silk. Grace stepped closer, holding out the USB drive. "I think you need to see this," she said. The words carried weight, not just the evidence, but the confidence in her voice. Vanessa laughed nervously. "Excuse me, what's this about?" Grace didn't smile. "It's about your family, the fire, the stolen child, and the truth you've all been hiding for years." Vanessa's smile faltered, her perfectly painted lips pressed into a thin line. You don't know what you're talking about." Grace tilted the USB drive slightly, letting the metallic edge catch the light. "I do. And if you ignore this, someone else will see it. And the fallout will be catastrophic." Vanessa's eyes narrowed. She glanced around the library. Guests milled nearby, oblivious. "I think you overestimate yourself," she whispered, her voice trembling just slightly. Grace leaned in. "I don't think so, I know." For a heartbeat they stared at each other, predator and prey, both aware of the game unfolding. Then Vanessa snatched the drive, her manicured fingers gripping it tightly. "I should tell Richard," Vanessa hissed. Grace shook her head. "You won't. Not yet. But remember, I'm not the only one who knows now." Vanessa's gaze flicked to the shadows behind Grace. Marcus, still watching, silent, imposing. The realization hit her. Grace had an ally. She had the advantage. Vanessa backed away, forcing a shaky smile. "This isn't over," she said, but her words were less like a threat, more like a warning, a promise that the first strike had been noticed. Grace stepped back, her pulse racing, adrenaline humming through her veins. The mansion felt different now, not as imposing, not as untouchable. She had made her move, and for the first time the Whitfords knew. The quiet waitress was not powerless. She didn't expect to see Richard. He was seated in the study, alone, a glass of whiskey catching the dim light. His expression was unreadable, equal parts anger and worry. "Grace," he said without looking up. "Stay there." Grace froze, unsure whether to retreat or approach. He finally lifted his gaze. "Sit." She obeyed. Richard sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. "You've stirred up a hornet's nest," he said quietly. "And you don't even know the half of it." Grace frowned. "I know enough. The fire, the adoption, the family secrets. I found the letter, Richard. I know the truth. Why hide it?" He leaned back, staring at the ceiling. "There are things you still don't understand. Things that could destroy lives. Not just mine, not just yours. Eleanor, Vanessa, even Marcus. Everyone has a role in keeping the family intact." Grace's pulse quickened. "Marcus knew about all this. He gave me the USB drive. You could have stopped him." Richard's jaw tightened. "You think I haven't tried?" "I have, but some truths, they're too dangerous. That fire, that night, it wasn't an accident. Someone wanted to erase a line of inheritance. And now that you've returned, they see the opportunity to finish what they started." Grace's stomach churned. "Finish what?" What are you saying?" He finally stood, pacing, voice rising. "Someone tried to kill you. Years ago. The fire wasn't random, it was planned. And they underestimated you, your resilience, your instincts. That's why you survived. That's why Eleanor hid you. And now, you've come back, and the old power games are starting again." Grace's hands trembled. "All this time, I've been part of their world and I didn't even know it." Richard's expression softened slightly. "You were never meant to know. Until now. Until someone decided it was time for the truth to emerge, and that someone might be closer than you think." Grace's mind raced. Could Richard be talking about Marcus? Or even Vanessa? "And there's more," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. I knew about the fire, too. I was the one who was supposed to—" He stopped, shaking his head. "I can't tell you everything yet. Not until I'm sure who's really on your side." Grace felt the weight of his words settle on her like a stone. Richard, the enigmatic, cold millionaire she had been wary of since the beginning, carried a secret that could change everything, a secret that could either protect her or destroy her. The room fell silent, the tension thick and unyielding. Grace realized that the enemy wasn't just the family's scheming members anymore. It could be Richard himself, the very person she had started to trust. And as she left the study that night, her heart pounding, she knew one thing. Nothing in the Whitford mansion was as it seemed. Not Eleanor, not Vanessa, not Marcus, and maybe not even Richard. The first clue came unexpectedly. A note slipped under the study door, written in the elegant hand of someone she trusted. "Meet me in the conservatory at noon. Trust no one else." Her pulse quickened. Trust no one? That included Marcus, even Richard. At precisely noon, she stepped into the conservatory. Sunlight spilled across lush greenery, but the beauty of the space was deceptive. Danger lingered in every shadow. Marcus was there, leaning casually against a marble column. "You came," he said, voice smooth, unreadable. Grace narrowed her eyes. "Who sent the note?" Marcus's smile didn't reach his eyes. "I did, but you should know. You're being watched. Vanessa knows you have the USB drive. And Richard, he might not be entirely honest with you either." Grace's stomach dropped. She had begun to trust Marcus, but now doubt gnawed at her. Before she could respond, the conservatory doors burst open. Vanessa stormed in, eyes blazing with fury, flanked by 2 imposing security guards. "You didn't think I'd let you make a move against us, did you?" Vanessa hissed. She gestured to Marcus. "Traitor," she spat. "I knew you'd try to manipulate her." Marcus stepped back, hands raised. "Vanessa, wait." Grace's mind raced. The betrayal was clear. Marcus had been playing both sides. The ally she had trusted might not be one at all. Vanessa advanced, voice low and dangerous. "You've poked around in things you don't understand, Grace. Secrets that could ruin this family. Secrets that will ruin you if you aren't careful." Grace's hands shook, not with fear, but with determination. "You think I'm powerless," she said, voice steady, "but you underestimated me. I have the truth. I have proof of everything." Vanessa's face hardened, but she hesitated. Grace could see the flicker of doubt. This was her moment. With a swift movement, Grace pulled the USB drive from her pocket and held it high. "This isn't just a threat. This is reality. I'm not the girl from the fire anymore. I'm the one who knows, and I won't be silenced." Vanessa froze. The guards looked uncertain. Even Marcus's confident smirk faltered. Grace realized something in that instant. Power wasn't about wealth, or manipulation, or secrecy. It was about knowing the truth, and having the courage to wield it. The room was silent, the air thick with tension. And then softly, Richard appeared at the doorway, his expression unreadable. "You're stronger than I expected, Grace," he said quietly. "But be careful. Exposing the past comes at a price." Grace met his gaze. "I'm ready," she said, for whatever comes next. Beginnings. The aftermath was swift. Vanessa's schemes unraveled when Grace presented the evidence to the board and the family attorney. Marcus, caught between loyalty and survival, revealed the extent of the Whitford family's manipulations and admitted his misjudgment in trusting anyone blindly. Eleanor, the deaf matriarch, embraced Grace with tears streaming down her face. "You were never forgotten, my dear," she signed, her hands trembling. "You were always part of this family, and now you belong where you are meant to be." Richard approached, this time not as a mysterious, intimidating figure, but as an equal. "You've changed everything," he said, "and somehow you've saved all of us from our own secrets." Grace looked around the mansion, the hallways, the study, the conservatory, now filled with sunlight and warmth instead of shadows and deception. She realized that her past, as painful and stolen as it had been, had prepared her for this moment. No longer shy, no longer powerless, Grace had found her voice, and with it, a place in the world she was always meant to claim. The Whitford mansion, once a place of secrets and betrayal, now stood as a symbol of truth, courage, and new beginnings.